Greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, Robert Meyer Burnett. I invite you to watch and listen to the Designing Hollywood podcast, brought to you by Martika Ibarra and the great, legendary Hollywood costume designer, Marilyn Vance. I am afforded the wonderful opportunity of co-hosting the show. If you are interested in the magic of Hollywood, the design of Hollywood, the clothes of Hollywood, watch the Designing Hollywood podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts from, or find the video version on the John Campea YouTube channel. That's right, the Designing Hollywood podcast. Why would you ever want to miss it? Especially if you love the movies.
Observations with Robert Meyer Burnett.
Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your master of fun and wonder, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your sommelier of sci-fi and cinema, your evangelist of the imagination, and the as-yet undefined existential Mr. Rogers. That's right, me, Robert Meyer Burnett, and I am robcasting at you imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. This is Robservations 874. You know, let's see now. As we all know, last night, Star Trek did boldly go where no Star Trek has gone before. They did a musical episode. A musical episode. Well, you know, the real question is why. Of course, I've asked myself why a lot about Star Trek since 2009, and frankly, I'm getting a little tired of myself, to be honest. And I feel I always need to clarify things, because whenever I say that I don't like something, and I usually do this on Twitter, and if I'm saying I don't like Star Trek, I'm never ever telling anybody else not to like it. I'm just saying how I feel. And yet, I always, old man shouting at clouds meme. If I had $100 for every time somebody sent me that meme, I'd be traveling around the world sipping champagne. I get called a gatekeeper, which is weird because I'm not keeping anyone from doing anything. And I'm not telling them that they can't enjoy what they want to enjoy. And people are always saying, well, who are you to say what Star Trek is? And I'm like, I'm really not to say what Star Trek is. Star Trek is what you make of it, I suppose. But there is a history of Star Trek, a 57-year history of Star Trek as an entertainment franchise. People tell me not to watch it. And it's really funny, which is strange to me. It's if you don't like it, why do you watch it? Well, there's lots of things that I've been fan of for a long time. You can't tell me to stop reading a comic book that I like simply because I really don't like the artist and writer team on it. But what I find so interesting is, and I want to make this point clear, Star Trek is not something from my childhood. And I think it needs to be addressed, because people are always going, well, how can you expect something from your childhood? First of all, and this is the great thing about Star Trek, this is why I love the franchise, I did start watching Star Trek as a child, back when I was 5 years old, when the only thing that existed of Star Trek were 79 original episodes of the original series. The Cage didn't air until 1988, so it didn't count. And during my childhood, there were 2 seasons, 22 episodes of the animated series. Suddenly I was getting Star Trek that was different. That was 73, 74. In 1979, Star Trek The Motion Picture came out using the entire cast. I was 12. And then, of course, we had from 79 to 87, you had Star Trek's 2, 3, 4 released in the theaters. So you had 4 Star Trek feature films. And in 1987, I'm now in college, Star Trek The Next Generation started. And in 89, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier was released. In 91, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country came out. 93, Deep Space Nine was released. 95, Voyager came out. And during this time, there were then 4 Next Generation movies. And then 2001, Enterprise started, went off the air in 2005. So, in my own lifetime, starting as a child, Star Trek as a storytelling medium, and keep in mind there were thousands of books and comics and all other kinds of things that I purchased, and model kits and action figures. Hell, I'm looking at a Star Trek action figure that goes on sale tomorrow. XO6 has their beautiful Krug figure going, the Krug from Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. So Star Trek has been something that's been there my whole life. It's not something from my childhood that I am holding on to for nostalgia purposes. No, it has been a franchise that for me has informed my life. Where am I at in my life, and what is the Star Trek that is being made for me now? And up through 2005, Star Trek changed. It grew. It added, sometimes subtracted, let's be honest, from its own mythology. As a storytelling medium, it grew and changed with the times. In the 80s, 87, a counselor was added to the bridge, acknowledging that mental health was a big concern, especially on long space voyages. And it was really, really interesting to watch Star Trek change and grow with the times. And it all had that Roddenberry DNA, and everybody kind of knew what a Star Trek story was supposed to be. But here's the thing. There were all kinds of different Star Trek stories that were told within the framework of what Star Trek was. I always thought of the original series, obviously my favorite, as an anthology show with recurring characters, because each episode was very different. And I've said before, even when Star Trek leaned heavily into comedy, there were basically 3 episodes that leaned into comedy. One was not quite all comedic, but Shore Leave, which opens with Alice in Wonderland and the White Rabbit. Then you had, of course, The Trouble with Tribbles and A Piece of the Action. But even when those episodes were, you could say they were ridiculous, they still told, they might have been comedic, but they were still great stories. What was going on with the Tribbles, it was really interesting. They were an ecological menace. They ended up doing some real damage. And the story itself, while funny, was a very legitimate story that delved into some really interesting political ideas. The Organian Peace Treaty that had been set up in the first season, we learned that canonically that if the Klingons and the Federation had a disputed planet, in this case Sherman's planet, whichever group, whichever call them nation state, could best develop that planet, they would be awarded the planet. Very interesting. That's what Trouble with Tribbles delved into. So even though it was funny, it still was a very legitimate story that had elements of politics, of science fiction, of character, all kinds of things that made it legitimate. A Piece of the Action, the Chicago Mobs of the 20s story, which I've often cited, it's very funny. However, the idea of what one book from Earth could do to a developing society, it was a graphic depiction of why the Prime Directive was necessary. The USS Horizon had arrived 100 years earlier and left behind a book, Chicago Mobs of the 20s. It was pollution, cultural pollution, that literally changed the course of an entire race on a planet, the Sigma Iotans, an imitative people. So even though it was a funny story, it was legitimately a great Star Trek tale that delved into, one, the dangers of cultural pollution, but also how then did Kirk and Spock and the crew of the Enterprise navigate these waters? Could they put things back? What did they do? They ended up having to cut the Federation in for a piece of the action, which the people understood to mitigate the damage was done 100 years before there was even a Prime Directive. So the stories were legitimate stories that were also thought-provoking and compelling, even though they were in the framework of a comedic episode. Shore Leave, again, a story that had both peril and humor in it. But when you find out that the Shore Leave planet was created for advanced aliens, And Spock at the end of that episode says, the greater the mind, or wait, the more complex the mind, the greater the need for the simplicity of play. Something we understand even today. This is why the original series, and this is why Star Trek endures to this day. Star Trek is the original series. Without an understanding of the original series and the stories being told and the time these stories were being told, it really is impossible to understand what Star Trek is all about or what it's supposed to be about. And this is not my version of what Star Trek is. Star Trek, the original series, is the template of everything that came after. And for 21 years, the original series, 21 years of my life, was the only Star Trek there ever was. So when people are always asking me what Star Trek is, you have to go back to the original series. It's the original text. It's what it is. Everything you need to know about Star Trek is there. Specifically, the character of Spock. Now, in 2009, when J.J. Abrams took over the franchise, when Bad Robot took over the franchise, there was I think, a strangely misguided, but I understand it from a corporate standpoint, to go back to the original, to go back to Kirk and McCoy and Spock and show how they first met and their first adventure. The problem was, the very conception of that, I think, was a mistake, because Star Trek was a franchise that was always moving forward and evolving, or moving backward and evolving. And to then go back and go over well-trodden ground, and this is the ground that the creator himself, Gene Roddenberry, had already covered. All that you were going to do is change what Star Trek was supposed to be. They wanted to update it, make it for a more modern audience, and I would dare say, like every great story, the colloquialisms there might be something wrong with them. The Old English might be difficult to read, but great stories endure. They don't need to be changed. They can be updated, sure. I love a lot of Shakespeare adaptations that I've seen. For instance, Richard III with Ian McKellen. If you're not a Shakespeare fan or you think it's beyond you, I would suggest everyone take a taste of McKellen's Richard III. Or Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, of course, the Blade Runner of Star Trek movies. Hell, look at Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet or Henry V. He gives a hell of a St. Crispin's Day speech, that Kenneth Branagh. But great stories endure. They don't need to be changed. And the problem is, if they're going to be changed, you hope the minds that are changing them are as great as at least the people that came up with the original idea. Because whether or not you could write as well as Shakespeare, the story of Romeo and Juliet has been translated into musicals like, well, West Side Story. Or Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, what he did with it there. But that story has been, or go back to Zeffirelli's original movie, that is, of Romeo and Juliet. The key, though, is to make a story well told. And one of the frustrating things about new creators that come along and look at the stories that they want to reimagine in their own way, which is, I have no problem with that. As a matter of fact, I liked Julie Taymor's Titus, Anthony Hopkins, the Titus Andronicus version, another great Shakespeare adaptation. But what is frustrating is when the creators of something completely misread the original intent, or misread and not understand a foundational part of the mythology that they're delving into. And I would say that Spock himself, the character of Spock, since 2009, has been completely misunderstood. Because the people that are making modern Star Trek since 2009, I mean, look, Alex Kurtzman and Bob Orci wrote Star Trek 09. Everyone knows, if you go back and read the interviews, it was Bob Orci, who's the Star Trek fan. I had met Bob Orci at Brandon Routh and Courtney's marriage. Bob Orci is related to her. I had a nice long conversation with him. He understood Star Trek, but he had a director, J.J. Abrams, that couldn't tell people he was not a Star Trek fan enough. On every interview we ever did, you can look it up and see it. And of course, Alex Kurtzman, coming from Xena, Warrior Princess and all that, not to disparage those fans, but Kurtzman didn't know fuck all about Star Trek either. And now he's in charge of it, and it shows. But the most egregious mistake that modern Star Trek has made is the portrayal of Spock. And let me be very clear about this. Spock is indeed half human. His mother is human, Amanda, and his father is Sarek, a Vulcan. But Spock decided from a very early age that he was going to follow the Vulcan philosophy. His human physiology has really nothing to do with problems in his life. He is half human, but it doesn't really matter. Now, how do we know this about Spock? Well, the person I think most responsible for defining Spock in the original series was Dorothy Fontana. And I think, obviously, people can talk about Amok Time. You can go back to the first season of Star Trek and look at episodes like This Side of Paradise. But how do we know the most we know about Spock? Because it's in Dorothy Fontana's second season Star Trek episode, Journey to Babel. Spock has a conversation with his mother where he lays it right out. And he says, I decided to follow the Vulcan philosophy. He is not conflicted about his human side. And when he decided to do that, he knew, because of his own people, that being half human was a handicap for him. So not only was it enough for him to follow the Vulcan philosophy, he had to be the best Vulcan. And that was kind of the point. And yes, when he was, but since then, there has been this misreading of the character that his physiology has somehow retarded whatever it is that he's supposed to be, which is really ridiculous. He flat out says it in Journey to Babel. He tells his mother, and he says, you know what? I'm not going to give my father the transfusion he needs because I've got diplomats on the ship. There's an enemy alien ship shadowing us. I don't know what's going on, but my father would understand. He would understand. I decided to study the Vulcan philosophy. And this idea, because they use the one shot, Spock has smiled in Star Trek. Yes, he smiled in the cage. Now, was this because he let his emotions get the best of him? Even as a kid, I thought, probably not. If you see the scene in the cage when they beam down to Talos 4, the one where he smiles, there is that sound effect that they have on the planet that we all know from Star Trek. But in the cage, it was really interesting because Spock goes up to this plant, puts his fingers on it, and the sound stops. It's the wind causing the sound through these leaves. Now, I, as a kid, when I was watching the Menagerie Parts 1 and 2 and would see this scene, Spock smiles, and yes, that is emotion. But I always took it as a scientist taking, and I know delight is emotion, but a scientist finding a property on a planet that they've never been on before, amazing. It's what Spock got into Starfleet for. Rather than going to the Vulcan Science Academy, he went out and joined Starfleet and wanted to see the universe. Spock is a man, and also here's another mistake, Vulcans have emotion. In fact, Vulcans' emotions are much more passionate and volatile than human beings are. And what the philosophy of Surak did to the Vulcan people was allow them so they weren't torn asunder by themselves. They adopted logic. It's all an intellectual pursuit. It is a choice by all Vulcans to pursue the teachings of Surak and understand how to control their emotions. They can do that. They're touch telepaths. So their Vulcan physiology is, if anything, Spock might not be as powerful of a touch telepath, but what he has done is he's developed the Vulcan side of himself. At the same time, he had a human mother. Spock does not misunderstand or not understand at all humanity. He's grown up with a human mother since he was a kid. He knows exactly what humans are all about. He's studied one his entire life. the person closest to him, his mom. So this idea in modern Star Trek that Spock is somehow unformed. Spock is probably the most formed Vulcan of all because he made the choice to walk the Vulcan path. This is something that is not understood by modern Star Trek. Why? Because they took the easy sophomoric ninth grade route and say, "Ooh, he's a man of two worlds, so he was young and he wasn't fully formed." Spock was the most fully formed Vulcan you'll probably ever meet because he made that choice. There is no conflict in him. He isn't wet behind the ears. And this idea that they've made him that way, sure, he's working his way up in the ranks, but I would say of all the Vulcans that have ever existed, he was probably the most formed because he decided to be. That's what allowed him, and his experience with his human mother growing up allowed him to go to Starfleet and rise up in the ranks very quickly. And if you watch the original series, you would understand that Spock has a dry wit, a laconic humor. He makes jokes. He understands how to employ humor. Why? Because he learned it from his mother. And it's not like, for him, being a Vulcan is a point of, even though it's emotional, it's a point of pride. He knew that being call him a half-breed, right next to the dog-faced boy, he had to be better than every other Vulcan. That's his gift. That's what makes him a great character. Now, is he conflicted? Always. Because he also has that human upbringing and he understands the value because his mother was a loving, caring human being, and Spock respected her immensely, and he saw what humans are capable of because his own mother showed him the love that he couldn't acknowledge the way she probably wanted him to. But as an intellect, he understood what that love meant. And it is so frustrating to watch a show, and indeed movies, that have been coming out since 2009 that have a fundamental misunderstanding of the character of Spock, especially Strange New Worlds. Ethan Peck is a fine actor, but what they've given him to play is, it's very difficult. I feel like people aren't literate when it comes to how they've written Spock. And my real frustration is, it's all there in the text. It's all there, but you'd have to watch it. And another problem with modern Star Trek is that they can't go back and watch Star Trek. I've said this a lot before on the show. They can't go back and watch the original series and look at it the way it was meant to be looked at. Because Star Trek has been around for 57 years, and I understand this. I don't begrudge anybody for this. They can't watch the original series without their pop culture Simpsons memes or parodies and Saturday Night Live and Jim Carrey playing Kirk. And there's been so much pop culture that is opined on Star Trek that it is next to impossible to watch Star Trek and see it for what it really was. And I don't meet a whole lot of writers today, especially writers in their 20s, 30s, even in their early 40s, that have, honestly, the capability of going back and watching Star Trek and taking it seriously. I can look at reaction videos on YouTube from people that are watching the original series, and they can't watch it without having an ironic distance between them and the shows. It really does take somebody who's... maybe it's impossible for somebody to go back and watch Star Trek for the first time and get it. There are some people, because I hear from them. That said, all of that said, they decided to do a musical episode of Star Trek. A musical episode. I'm gonna pause that for a minute. If you will allow me 2 or 3 minutes, I have to deal with a barking dog. I will be right back. Apologies, everyone. Apologies. Thanks for that. So, it's funny. Coming back, I'm like, who am I talking to? So, this brings me to another thing about modern Star Trek. They have made both Discovery and now Strange New Worlds prequels to the original series, which they set themselves up for a number of different, I think, problems, because if you can only look back at Star Trek with the 57 years gaze, as I like to call it now, and you can't look at it seriously, you're just thinking to yourself, oh, the sets are cheesy, which they're not. The special effects they're not cheesy either. They were state of the art for the time. But if you can't look at those things the way they were meant to be when they were first looked at by audiences for the first time in the 60s, the first thing that you're going to come up with is an impulse to change things and modernize it. Unfortunately, you also have right now we're getting some of the greatest television ever. As I've said on the show the last couple weeks, the Emmy Award nominees, both in comedy and drama, are fantastic. We're living through a golden age of great programming, which means you would think that with shows like The Expanse, which is obviously based on books, but still, we're getting a lot of Torchwood, Children of Earth, Ron Moore and David Icke's Battlestar Galactica. We've seen a lot of great televised science fiction. One of the things about Star Trek now is, unlike Star Trek in 1966, the people that are writing Star Trek do not understand science fiction. And they don't understand how to establish the kind of world building. You'd think Star Trek has already given you all of this world building, but it's completely ignored. It was ignored by Star Trek Discovery. It's ignored by Strange New Worlds. And that creates a real disconnect, especially considering the fact that of all the fictional worlds ever cataloged, Star Trek probably has, there's Tolkien, there's probably Harry Potter, maybe James Bond, but Star Trek has literally thousands upon thousands of text pages and God knows how many entries in Memory Alpha explaining it all. What modern Star Trek has done, if you ask the people that do Star Trek Online, it's completely trashed all of the world building that happened for the better part of 50 years. It really has. It's run roughshod all across all of canon, and so it's really difficult. And then when they try and give you things that you're supposed to believe in, it's really hard because so little thought has been put into creating a credible reality of modern Star Trek. It is, and make no mistake, modern Star Trek is not a science fiction show. Modern Star Trek is a fantasy show. It's completely fantasy. The writers, as evidenced by last night's musical episode, the pinnacle of their television experience was clearly Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Not only because that they've cited that as their influence, but all that show was, first of all, it was set in an American high school, and it was all about the interpersonal. Yeah, of course, you lived on a hellmouth, and there was monsters and everything, but what was really interesting about Buffy that made it so compelling is that you had this great horror fantasy show, but at the same time, you had the trials and travails of high school kids and their interpersonal relationships. Well, that's basically what we're getting with modern Star Trek, is that we are getting Buffy the Vampire transposed into Star Trek. The characters are kind of the same. The interpersonal relationships are kind of the same. And it's a fantasy. There's no credible science fiction at all in modern Star Trek. Oh, sure, they throw around concepts, but none of it works. None of it holds together. A kid's DNA combining with dilithium, and he screams, he gets mad, so he destroys all the dilithium in the galaxy to create a fuel shortage. I mean, we won't rehash all that, but you know what I mean. But anyway, so now we come down to a musical episode of Star Trek. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is talk about the musical as a form. I am a musical fan. I grew up, my grandmother took me to a lot of the great, when they would come to Seattle, I saw things like, I saw Les Mis here in LA at a theater that no longer exists. I saw The Fantastics. I saw Cats. I saw, let's see, what other, you name it. I saw a great, I don't remember what it was. I saw Camelot. I saw it with Katharine Hepburn. It wasn't a musical, but I want to say The Last Waltz, but that's not the name of it. But, yeah, I saw Annie. I saw a great play that I always thought should have been adapted for a movie called City of Angels. Book of Mormon, whatever. I'm a musicals fan. And I like films. I like musical films. West Side Story was always one of my favorite films. But I want to talk about my favorite musical and what I think is one of the great musicals in cinematic history, which should come as no surprise to anyone, but Singing in the Rain. Singing in the Rain, to me, is a perfect musical. And why I love Singing in the Rain is, first of all, it takes place in the milieu that it takes place in is in 1920s Hollywood, on the cusp of the silent era giving way to the sound era. Now, what's interesting about that is that story, you have a whole group of actors that have never had to deal with their voice before. And one of the most famous, Lena Lamont, she has a terrible voice. What's the matter with my voice? So she's not going to make it. And Donald O'Connor and Gene Kelly, they're vaudevillians that probably are going to do just fine in the new world of sound. But it's a very interesting milieu that itself has historical context. It's an interesting place to be. It's where a pivotal moment where the arts itself is going to change in terms of the technology of cinema. But I found this article that I wanted to read from the Evening Standard. And it's an old article, I think, but it's not that old. And I just wanted to read a little bit about Singing in the Rain. It's by Jessie Thomson, and this was published on July 29th, 2001. Whether you're a Singing in the Rain superfan or have never seen the film in your life, the opening bars are immediately recognizable, eminently hummable, and instantly cheering. Their continued grip on our collective imagination over 70 years since the film was first released encapsulates the sheer carefree pleasure of the musical itself, which is regularly voted the greatest movie musical ever made. This summer, it comes to splishy, splashy life on the Sadler's Wells stage. After a drought of high-kicking, top-class live musical escapism, it's a glorious feeling, and we're happy again. It may now have the timeless quality of a gold-minted Hollywood classic, but Singing in the Rain, released in 1952 but set in the late 1920s, marked a specific turning point for the film industry, where silent films were replaced by talkies. In the most iconic role of his career, Gene Kelly played Don Lockwood, a leading man who moves with the times by using music to keep himself relevant. Less smooth is the transition of powerful diva Lena Lamont, whose abrasive New York accent causes considerable alarm to audiences. "I can't stand him," as she squeaks desperately in elocution lessons. Often described as the musical for people who don't like musicals, thanks to its perfectly balanced combination of romance, comedy, and pastiche, it has its own set of behind-the-scenes myths, too. Kelly allegedly had 103-degree fever when he filmed the iconic title scene, while Debbie Reynolds, playing chorus girl turned starlet Kathy, was drafted in as Lena's voiceover. Apparently had to be carried off set after a marathon 13-hour shoot for the good morning scene made her feet bleed. "The two hardest things I ever did in my life are childbirth and singing in the rain," she once said. The production at Sadler's Wells, directed by Jonathan Church, first ran at the Chester Festival Theater in 2011 when he was artistic director there, before transferring to the West End. It isn't the first theatrical version. It premiered at the London Palladium in the 1980s, before a now notorious flop version on Broadway, but it is one of the most successful. So what exactly is it that makes Singing in the Rain so endlessly appealing? There's an old saying about musicals. If you can't say it, you sing it. If you can't sing it, you dance it. The perfect illustration of that to me is Kathy and Don's number, "You Were Meant for Me," says Church. He has to sing to her to describe how he feels about her. And to her, singing is inadequate, so it goes into the most amazing dance duet. Its perfectly musical form, and you keep hitting moments where structurally, musically, and emotionally, things come together. Look at those kids. It was part of an era of post-war movies that aimed to bring joy and love and all of those positive things as we recovered from the war, he adds. Coming out of our own crisis now, Church and the company have felt all of those things in the rehearsal room. That means COVID. But he also thinks that the engine of the plot, sound coming to silent movies, has a drive that's rare to find in musicals. Everybody's job is at stake. Lena Lamont, who I know is on some level a figure of fun, is about to lose her career and livelihood and status. For Robin Baker, the head curator at BFI National Archive, Singing in the Rain proves that popular entertainment can be high art. It's nearly always voted best film musical, but actually it's up there with the best romantic comedy ever made, one of the best films ever made about show business, and one of the best films about movies and movie-going, he says. When the BFI screened it as part of a celebration of musicals in 2019, he was struck by its rare intergenerational appeal. Look at the age mix of audiences. Virtually none of them would have even seen the film the first time, he says. It feels wholly untarnished by age. The thing's almost 70 years old. It's remarkable. Janine Basinger, a film historian and founder of the Department of Film Studies at Wesleyan University, did see it when it was originally released, then many times more while working as a cinema usher. It never failed to be fun, she says. Over the last 40 years, she's often returned to it when programming screenings for students or community audiences. There are one or two old movies that you can always feel safe showing. They never fail to please because they are still what they set out to be. They've not lost their charm or become mean-spirited or useless in any way. There are a handful of true surefire old movies, and Singing in the Rain is one of them, she says. Its influence is so ubiquitous that it isn't always obvious. Michael Jackson's Billie Jean moves were inspired by Gene Kelly, while Baker sees a through line reflected in the sardonic tone of the French comedy Call My Agent. In fact, its influence is such that it's become an omnipresent cultural reference point. It's impossible for any director making a musical at any time since Singing in the Rain to not think about it, says Baker. There are those like La La Land or Jacques Demy's The Young Girls of Roquefort, where he even cast Gene Kelly in it, that feel like the live spirit of Singing in the Rain is channeled through. But more widely, it shapes how and what we expect of musicals now. The word technicolor is almost impossible to separate from it. In an essay in her book, The Movie Musical, Basinger points out that in the script, the pivotal rain scene is simply written as Dawn dances in the wet street. But she writes, on screen, these 6 words become 4 minutes of song and dance that define Gene Kelly and are often used to define the whole genre of original Hollywood musicals. The rain dance, so easy, so relaxed, so happy and emotional, so simple, just a carefree little moment on film. But what did it take to put it up there? And that's another part of the magic. They make it look so effortless. Prior to rehearsals with the rest of the company, the Sadler-Wells leads, Adam Cooper, who also played Don at Chester, Charlotte Gooch, and Kevin Clifton had to attend a boot camp to learn the material and keep up their fitness. It's very easy to underestimate the sheer force of will and energy that went into making the film in the first place, the craft involved. Our job and Gene Kelly's job when they made the film was to make it look easy, but it was pretty Herculean, said Church. Achieving greatness, then, is no simple matter. The alchemy that looks like perfection comes from the efforts of many people, all at the top of their game, pulling together and seizing a moment. And that's why Singing in the Rain is still so cherished. Musicals are quite elusive. We all wait for a Hamilton or a Les Mis to come along, but they don't grow on trees, says Church. I think in a world where it's complicated to make shows like This Land, they stand as a beacon. Well, I agree. Here's the thing. In the Buffy musical, Once More with Feeling, besides the demon that causes everyone to sing, that show is about the interpersonal relationships of the cast. Their romantic encounters, Buffy's being torn between Angel and Spike, Willow's involved with people. There's a lot going on about interpersonal relationships because that's what the show was. It was a show, ultimately, take the fantasy away from it. It was about friends working together to become better people and get through their high school and then college experiences. That's what it was about. That's what the DNA was about. And luckily, a musical could have served it well. Now, the thing about Star Trek, it was conceived as wagon train to the stars. Westerns were big. That's why the first couple of episodes of Star Trek, you see things like Mud's Women. Literally, there's a guy taking brides to miners. It was ripped out of that time. We don't really do that anymore, but early episodes of Star Trek can be accused of that kind of thing because that's what they were doing. But Star Trek at its core is an allegorical action-adventure science fiction show, which, through the prism of the future of the 23rd century, the period piece, future period piece, the future that it's showing us, an optimistic vision of humanity prevailing and going out into the stars, it is still an action-adventure science fiction show that was supposed to, hopefully, through the stories it was telling, illuminate truths about our own lives in the 60s, and now even today. That has changed in modern Star Trek. Why? Because the people writing Star Trek don't know how to write science fiction. You could say that Michael Chabon even wrote a pretty good science fiction book, yeah. And Akiva Goldsman certainly adapted science fiction, because it was written down for him and he could adapt it. Whether it was Richard Matheson, who wrote for the original Star Trek, ironically, wrote the book I Am Legend that Akiva Goldsman then went to work on. I wish he'd read more Matheson other than the book that he just adapted. But the problem is that can the musical paradigm work within what a Star Trek story is supposed to be? And I would say, sure, why not? You need clever people. But the problem with Star Trek is it's no longer a science fiction show. It's a fantasy. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's no longer an allegorical action-adventure science fiction show. It's really more of a workplace drama that's all about the interpersonal relationships. I mean, if we were watching the paradigm of, and whenever I say it's Star Trek as a quasi-military navy, it's a space navy, that's really what it is. Well, Gene didn't want it to be the Navy, that's why he didn't like Star Trek 2 and all this. It still was designed to be a space navy, hence the ranks. You know, lieutenants, captains, ensigns. And as Roddenberry himself would say, it's based on the Horatio Hornblower novels. And what was Horatio Hornblower about? A navy. Naval people. That's literally what it was supposed to be. Modern Star Trek does not have any sense that it's an actual functioning military. There's no real chain of command. You know Pike's captain, but hey, Uhura, if you want to give an order, you go ahead. I'll back you up. So the actual world building in modern Star Trek is out the window. And that's one of the reasons I can't stand it. As a matter of fact, I'm hard-pressed to know if the people writing the show even understand military rank. Do they know? Certainly in Star Trek Discovery, the actors don't know what their rank is, much less the writers. And these are the things that are irksome, because if their world building isn't credible, and we're supposed to skate on the 57-year-old original series to understand how all that works, which is bizarre to me. But anyway, let's get back to the idea of the musical. And again, Star Trek Strange New Worlds can't help itself but rip off others. Not only do they rip off other science fiction franchises, they do it in a way that's so obvious. Like, for instance, when Michael and Denise Okuda might have put the name Yamato, or they called a fellow starship, a Galaxy-class starship, the Yamato, as an homage to Space Battleship Yamato, a.k.a. Star Blazers, not everybody knew that. They do it, but not everybody knew it. And the reason that people don't know what I'm about to say is only because they don't read, and they haven't kept up on, a radio show, a TV series, a movie. But so in this musical, they needed a way, okay, we're going to do a Star Trek musical. Well, what's it going to be about? All we know is it's going to be about the interpersonal relationships of our characters. It's about no less than 3 romantic relationships, La'an and Kirk, Spock and Chapel, and Pike and his girlfriend. I mean, first of all, how do you make a Star Trek musical and don't come up with a great science fiction story? They have the idea that, like Trouble with Tribbles, the Klingons are out there. Maybe they're both vying for a planet or something along those lines. I don't know. But you could say, okay, they found a space anomaly that is improbable. Literally, they just borrow from Hitchhiker's Guide, the infinite improbability drive. That's impossible. No, just very, 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 very improbable. That drove me crazy from the get-go. Why cite another science fiction show, your actual anomaly? Every time they said the word improbability or improbable, all I could hear was Journey of the Sorcerer or whatever, the piece of music, with the banjo playing from Hitchhiker's Guide. Why do they do this constantly? Modern Star Trek is constantly torpedoing itself because what it does is it breaks the fourth wall immediately. If you're referencing Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, immediately my fourth wall is shattered. And people say, well, Rob, not everyone knows Hitchhiker's Guide. Well, okay, maybe that's true. But a lot of people do. And if you're going to do that, it's a little odd. I'm showing red, like I'm not broadcasting anymore, which is, and hopefully we're back. So that bothered me. So this idea is there's a subspace fold and they're trying to send supercharged subspace messages. I don't even think the writers of the episode could tell you what it was that subspace fold was doing. All they needed was some kind of bullshit device by which the musical stuff could happen. Very odd. Anyway, the American Songbook. Well, the American Songbook doesn't have every American song in it, nor does it have every musical style. Now, here's my problem with a space anomaly. I mean, we're trying to send a signal through subspace because that's how subspace communications works. It's faster than, say, radio. But what happened in the show last night presupposes some kind of alien intelligence or somebody. They didn't just send back the whole conceit was our emotions were involved. This thing could sense. There's some kind of intellect behind all of this based on harmonics or, I mean, it was fairly clever, I guess, but it didn't make a lick of sense. And really all this episode was, it used the musical to deal with interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal relationships that, to be honest, I don't give a fuck about. Why is Star Trek devoting so much time to who's fucking who on the show? Who cares? I mean, why don't you tell me a great science fiction story? That's what I tune in to Star Trek for. I mean, what am I... Do they treat their whole audience like we're in 7th grade and gossiping about who kissed who? Does anybody care? Tell me a good fucking story. Once. Give me a good science fiction story. I mean, last week, one of our main characters might have murdered a Klingon. An ambassador that, I mean, if Una's getting busted for lying to Starfleet, a Klingon ambassador, whatever happened to him, is dead on the Enterprise? After Pike has said, this is really important that we make sure this ambassador is taken care of. I would think that the Enterprise will be called back to headquarters and decommissioned, at least for a while, and talk about an investigation that needs to be run. What about the Klingon Empire? Where are we at there? I mean, no consequences. Anyway, so now we jump into a musical episode, and next week we get to deal with Hegemony, the ridiculous Gorn that they've completely destroyed as a credible threat. They went from you go from little baby xenomorphs to being a spacefaring race that commands greater technology than the Enterprise, which, by the way, they wouldn't have met the Gorn at this point in canonical Star Trek history, but that's neither here nor there. I'm going off on a tangent. But from a storytelling perspective, I think it would have been really interesting. All this thing, there's a bullshit problem, but the music, I mean, doesn't really have much to do with the problem at hand. It's just the thing causes the problem, and then we have to figure out a way to stop the problem, and that's one thing. There's really not much there. There's not much story there. It's so now we can delve into the fact that La'an she's insecure about herself. She doesn't know how to let anyone really see her. And she's in love with Jim Kirk. And by the way, why is Jim Kirk a main character on the show now? But what does that have to do? What's the science fiction action adventure component of that they met in a different timeline? Well, Jim Kirk doesn't seem too concerned about that. And this idea, like Carol Marcus, when does that ever come up before? When Kirk in his travels around the galaxy. He didn't seem too concerned. Maybe that was before or after Kirk and Carol had. But I'll tell you something. I did what you asked. I stayed away, is what Kirk says about Carol Marcus because she's pregnant. What does that say about Kirk? I don't know. But there's something that I didn't enjoy about the way it was presented in last night's episode. But here's the thing that was really irksome. Back to Spock. Spock is acting like a lovelorn puppy. And here's where the portrayal of Spock, once again, this show, anytime it can belittle Spock or do anything to take him down a peg, it will. So in this episode, we already saw Spock break up with T'Pring, and it was mere hours before him and Nurse Chapel were shagging up. Well, so Nurse Chapel finally gets this Vulcan medical seminar that she gets to go to. It's basically she's going to summer camp for the summer. But like these writers who are stuck watching Buffy, they're like, oh my God, she's going away for the summer. Who knows what's going to happen? Well, we know what's going to happen. She's going to meet Roger Corby because that's canonical. Whenever they want to cherry pick a little cannon and throw it in there and go, see, we're paying attention. She's going to meet Roger Corby. For those of you who want to know who Roger Corby is, watch the episode What Are Little Girls Made Of from the first season. But anyway, so a Vulcan who has chosen to walk the path of Surak and who has a human mother would probably be the first person to say, Christine, that's terrific. Why are there problems between Christine? First of all, it's a problem that Spock would be fucking his coworker. First of all, that's the number one problem. I don't believe that for an instant, but let's go with it because that's what they're trying to tell us. Because the high school mentality that this show is written with, well, of course they are. Spock was fucking Uhura in the movies. What is this obsession? I really don't understand, because that in itself is not what Spock would be doing, fraternizing with his crew. That is not a logical thing to do. Of course, no one thinks about that. But so we go with it. So what is the problem? You would think that Spock would be the first person to say to Christine, that's great. I'll see you when you get back. Don't think about me. Have the best time. Get the greatest experience you can out of it. But no, Spock is literally, he sings a song about being her ex. Spock is singing about being her ex. And I'm like, what the fuck? Why would he... Look, if you've adopted the Vulcan philosophy of not allowing your emotions to show, but they're always bubbling underneath the surface. No, Spock can control these things. In like the original series, when he's blasted by the spores in This Side of Paradise, he can't. And you want to watch an episode where Spock he gives into his human self, and the path that he's chosen to walk is completely stripped away. Watch This Side of Paradise, a beautiful, incredibly well executed episode about Spock, showing exactly who and what he is. And at the end, when he says, for a moment, I was happy. It's heartbreaking. And it's a million times better than the drivel that they give Ethan Peck to play in this show. And, his big musical numbers. And, of course, I have to say, I really did enjoy the cast. And some of the songs were actually clever. But they were all obvious. They all told us things we already knew. There was nothing, the songs were not clever. They just had to make this musical episode. So they're all didactic. And you could say, Rob, well, some of your favorite musicals, when Tony is talking about Maria in West Side Story, when they meet at the school dance, and you realize how much she's affected him. When he's singing, Maria, I've just met a girl named Maria, and suddenly my life will never be the same again. He's actually forwarding the plot, because you can see how much he was taken with her, but then he goes home and the plot is being furthered. And of course you could say, well, when Lon talks about, I wish people could see me, we already know that about her. We already know that about her. And if anything, you could say like Una's flying around her quarters with La'an was sort of interesting. But there was I think, a real missed opportunity to delve into the science fiction aspect of it. But they don't know how. They don't know. Wouldn't it have been really interesting? So at the end of the episode, and I'm trying not to be that spoilerish. At the end of the episode, we see from the beginning, you see Uhura. By the way, she's great. Uhura, trying to make the connections because the communication systems are down, and at the end, they have to get the energy and passion of the crew all up to this. They had a really interesting opportunity with the Klingons. I mean, they have to tell us, because they think we're stupid, what the crew of the Enterprise is all about. We know this. We've known what the crew of a starship does. We know what Kirk's crew and now Pike's crew has been doing for 57 fucking years. But they tell this big, big story because the big number is all about, we're the Enterprise crew and we can get it done. Yankee Doodle Dandy. As if this is new information. But you bring in the Klingons, what they did to the Klingons is unconscionable. One joke, I can't even, it's so, you can see the memes, it's already been memed. It's so awful. I can't even begin to tell how awful it is. But what really, if they were clever, if they really thought about what was going on, they should have, with the Klingons coming and they should have set up an MC battle. And they could have had the Klingons fighting musically. It's a fucking 8 Mile rap battle. That's what they should have done. And the Klingons were singing their opera. And it turns out that together, with the two crews playing off one another, you could have had a really Star Trekian, very interesting, again, it'd be the end of Day of the Dove, which is a 3rd season original series episode, where the crew is fighting against this alien entity. They're fighting against one another because they've been pitted against one another by this alien that's feeding off of their anger. Well, if anybody had watched Star Trek that made this episode, they might have come up with the idea that, we could have had these crews, we could cooperate, and the message would have been that two disparate forces could find a common reason to band together. And you could have done something really fun with the Klingon crew, but they turned them in, like they always do, into a punchline, into a joke. And it was really unfortunate. So ultimately, what did I think of this episode? I didn't hate it. I want to be clear. I didn't hate it. There was some clever songs in it. I thought the choreography was lacking, but I understand it's not their strong suit, so who cares? And the performances, I really do like this cast. I really do. I like the cast. I thought Christina Chong, she recently she dropped a single in real life. I really like her as an actress. Why does she have to be related to Khan Noonien and Singh? Again, an Akiva Goldsman idea that is monumentally stupid. That every time I hear it, not only does it break canon, it's just dumb. Yeah, I'm a descendant of Khan Noonien and Singh. Really? How'd that happen? I mean, when they bring this stuff up, you got to explain it. Explain to me how a descendant of Khan Noonien and Singh survived the end of the eugenics wars, which they changed. They probably didn't even think about it. He's just like, that's cool. It's not cool and it's dumb. It would have been far better if you let her be her own character and you didn't have to saddle her with this dumb backstory that she's Khan Noonien and Singh's 300-year-old descendant, as if anyone would give a fuck. They wouldn't. And yet every time I go somewhere, people look at my name. Let me ask you this. If you heard somebody's last name, would you know that 300 years ago, one of their family members committed horrible atrocities? Or would you be like McCoy and Scotty and Kirk? I have to admit, gentlemen, I've always had a sneaking admiration for this one. They don't even know that Khan was the best of the tyrants. I mean, Khan was not necessarily a terrible person. According to our own crew back in the 66-67 season, Khan Noonien Singh, sure, he was a tyrant, but people weren't tortured. He was a despot, surely, but was he a bad guy? Would people really be giving Khan Noonien Singh shit 300 years later because of Khan, who mysteriously disappeared at the end of the eugenics wars? Maybe, in case they retcon that too. But this cast deserves better. They're squandered. And then, of course, we have Captain Pike is having an argument with his girlfriend on the bridge of the Enterprise, which might be kind of funny, but it so undermines this show as a credible science fiction action-adventure allegory, which it's just not smart enough to be. And I think ultimately that this music episode was a big disappointment. First of all, look, I will admit, I think the idea of doing a Star Trek musical is ridiculously stupid. But it was a lot better than I thought it was going to be. You could tell some real heart and soul was put into it by everybody involved. The problem is, like all of Strange New Worlds, it is constantly let down by the attitudes its creators have about the very show that they're making. They don't know what they have. Star Trek should be the Tiffany standard of televised science fiction, but it's not being written by anybody that understands science fiction or has read science fiction. And it's too bad, because the original Star Trek was written by some of the great fantasists of the 20th century. Star Trek deserves better. It does. And so does the audience. And so do the actors. And so does Paramount and CBS, because it should be way more successful than it is. Anyway, there you go. Let's see what you guys have to say. I know this is. I wasn't coming out. I'm not here to. I'm more melancholy about this than anything else, which kind of bums me out. But let's see. So let's see what you guys have to say. So, Tach Hart, or just Tach, says. Well, actually, first of all, Connor Thorn asks, "What are your thoughts on the temporal Cold War from Enterprise? I found it interesting, but somewhat contradicts how the other shows handle time travel. To be honest, didn't like that either. A temporal Cold War, the idea of changing time. I'm going to explain something to you that I mean, people are going to argue with me. But to me, time travel only works in a dramatic standpoint, is if there is one timeline, and then if you change the one timeline by doing something, that timeline is now changed, but there's still a single timeline. And if you have to turn it back, that's what you have. It's you flip the switch, it changes the timeline, or you flip the switch back. Everything else, all this multiverse and all that stuff, it makes time travel as a device stupid. It also gets too... Now, we've seen it used, obviously, like Year of Hell and in Voyager is the two-part is pretty good. But again, they can't do anything major, so the timeline is reset at the end. But to me, the great thing about a time travel story, which again needs to be understood as a dramatic device, time travel is based on the idea that all of us wish that we could have done something differently. If only we could have gone back and changed things. Or the idea that you could go and experience a life that you couldn't have. Wouldn't it have been great to take a video camera back to the crucifixion? Like, live from Golgotha, tonight, the crucifixion. Or something like that. I would like to have seen historical events. But for the most part, what makes time travel stories so interesting is the road less traveled. What can we do? So the whole thing about the temporal Cold War, it sounds cool on paper, but I think ultimately it's dramatically inert. Because it just creates a threat, which is you can't change the timeline, it's going to get changed all... Okay, but then you got to get rid of who's ever changing the timeline, and let's have it go back so we can do more of our stories. So I never dug it. I didn't dig it. I never dug the temporal Cold War. I mean, I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. And so there you go. Tach, says, I was born in the late 90s, so I saw the Star Wars prequels before the original trilogy. I will always suggest watching them in release order, because until I did, I never realized Yoda being a short green alien was supposed to be a twist to show anyone who could be a powerful Force user. The Empire Strikes Back is completely diminished if you don't watch it right after Star Wars. I mean, if you know who Yoda is, half the message of Empire is gone. Look at me, judge me by my size, do you? If you watch Empire in order, Luke's a douche. You don't know that Yoda's a Jedi Master? Did you not study your history on the jungle and wastes of Tatooine, going to Tatooine High when you were, with Fixer and Cammy up at Tashi Station hanging out? Did you go to school, dude? Did you not look, or do they not teach that anymore? I don't know. But it's, Yeah, you got to watch Star Wars in the release order. It's got to be Star Wars Empire. Although I would say this, if you want to go machete order, go Star Wars Empire, then jump back to Attack of the Clones and Sith, and then watch Jedi. I like that. So, you could do that. Scott Bartholomew says, since the inception of Star Trek in 1966, this one episode is the nadir of the entire franchise. Well, I would say this, a musical completely shatters the fourth wall of Star Trek. It's all gone now. It's completely shattered. And I think, in a way, between crossing over with Lower Decks, which is a show that is entirely breaking the fourth wall of Star Trek, and now this, there is no more Star Trek. It's all, the wall is shattered. I really think that after all of this, the smart way, and I suggested doing this back in 2016. I think I've written 2 Tumblr posts, and one of them I said, look, go back and reboot it. Take all the stuff we know, start from scratch. You know, it's funny. I really like Paul Wesley. I like him as an actor. I like him as a presence. And I love what he's doing with Kirk. I just don't believe him as Kirk. He's not Kirk. He's trying really hard, but I like him as an actor. If he was a new character and he wasn't Jim Kirk, I don't understand why they keep, don't they want to create new characters? I mean, I understand Carol Kane's interesting, but she's just Guinan Light. And, that's fine. But Nadir, I wouldn't say that, but it did perhaps break the franchise in a way that it hasn't been broken before. Behruz Hairullaey says, sorry, not Star Trek related. A few days ago, you made a point regarding how movies today are so safe of filth and no sex. However, Nolan said fucking in Oppenheimer. Oh, I didn't. Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. You went and saw Oppenheimer. You didn't know there was fucking in it, and you saw it with your dad. And boy, yeah, it's always weird seeing sex scenes with your parents. But you know what? They're not thinking about it as much as you're thinking about it. I promise you. You're embarrassed, but yeah. Dan Candy says, "Sing it, Rob. Heading out to." You can do this. You can do this in 2 different ways. You can be like, heading out to Eden, yay, brother. Heading out to Eden, yay, brother. No more trouble in my body or my mind. Gonna live like a king whenever I find. Eat all the fruit and throw away the rind. Yay, brother. Okay, that's another thing that people, or you can say, I'm gonna clap my hands and jump for joy. I got a clean bill of health from Dr. McCoy. That was another thing. Can I just say in this musical episode, all the different musical stylings, the American Songbook, what were the Klingons singing? That's another thing. I'm like, come on, guys, you could have done something really interesting. So a lot of people have brought up to me the episode, The Way to Eden, the 3rd season original series episode that has the space hippies. As it's not a great episode. I personally like it because aside from the obvious pandering to the youth of the time, the story itself is really interesting. And the idea that this group of people, we've seen them, we still know them, people that want to live off grid or whatever, call them what you want. They want to go build a world of their own. And they're led by a charismatic, call him a cult leader. And Chekhov used to date one of them. But what's really interesting about that is Spock breaks out his Vulcan harp, his lute, or lyra, whatever, lute. And he reaches them. We are one. He is able to, through music, show that he can sympathize. He sympathizes with their ideas and their plight. And in a way, he hopes they succeed. He helps them even look for the planet they're looking for, which is Eden. It's all very heavy-handed. But the show, even though it's ridiculous, and people laugh at Charles Napier singing, it still has, at its core, it's a really interesting, valuable story. It's not "And the Children Shall Lead," and it's not Spock's brain. So, yeah. So, and people keep bringing it up to me. Well, Star Trek's done a musical, and you're like, have you even watched that episode, or did you just watch a clip? Because the episode's pretty interesting. Joe Cronin Show says, this show is legit made for teenage drama students in a rich town. Look, I agree. There is no emotional, and I mean, my God, watch Journey to Babel. you can see the scene. Just look it up. Look up the scene with Jane Wyatt and Leonard Nimoy in Spock's cabin, or I think they're in her cabin's sick bay. I forget where they're at. Watch the scene between them. That's how adults, that's how a mother and son would talk to one another. A Vulcan son and a human mother whose son decided to walk the path of Surak. Watch that scene. It is so much more sophisticated and so much better. Look at the way Nimoy performs Spock in that scene. That's the way Spock should be written. And he was written that way 57 years ago. And he hasn't been written that way since 1991, and that's sad. Christopher Mays says, the writers saw how popular the Orville was and that it was the best Trek in years and are mindlessly making Strange New Worlds like the Orville, but they suck at it. It's true, because you can't make something... What's interesting is if they had leaned into the idea of Strange New Worlds, and they've got the cast, if they had come up with some really compelling allegorical science fiction action adventure stories like they should have. You know what Star Trek is now? It's only about itself. Star Trek is so far up its own ass that I don't even know if they can... Lower Decks can't tell a story that isn't self-reflexive to Star Trek. Strange New Worlds can't either. It's all about Star Trek and Star Trek canon and the Star Trek universe. The funny thing is, it should be exactly the opposite. I mean, Lower Decks is a show literally about Star Trek fans. People that love the Star Trek past, which is so weird. Tell an original... I mean, honestly... Prodigy might have been the best Star Trek show, and that was the one I was the most vehemently against at first. But Strange New Worlds, wouldn't it be great if they could actually tell an interesting science fiction speculative story? I mean, that would be great. I wish they could. But yeah, I think you're right, Christopher. Everyone wishes that it was... But the Orville is in itself a riff on Star Trek. So... Darth Plato says, hey, Rob, I'm curious. Is Strange New Worlds bad because of how the source material of TOS is handled? Or is Strange New Worlds bad because it's badly written overall? I think both. I mean, look, I would much prefer they don't deal with... I don't get why Christine Chapel, Mbenga, Spock, why do they have to keep taking Uhura, these characters from the original series? I don't understand why, as creators of the show... They don't want to create their own new characters. Kirk now, Sam, all these characters they're all like being put together willy-nilly, and I don't understand. But I think it's the writing. I think overall the stories are not compelling modern science fiction, action, adventure, allegorical tales. I don't think they have much to say to us, and everybody, it's all about, oh, I recognize the plights of these characters, the inner relationships. I mean, Spock... Oh, my girlfriend's going to summer camp for this summer, and now I'm going to sing a song about I'm the X. Why is he the X? This is the 23rd century. It's not fucking high school of 1987. And I don't get why they write it this way. It's really strange. But I think it's also problematic in that I don't necessarily think they know how to do better. I don't understand that, judging by the Emmy nominees for Best Comedy and Best Drama. There's a lot of great writers out there, and they're picketing on the street for a reason. There's a lot of great work being done, undercompensated work. But I mean, Star Trek, where are the actual science fiction writers for this show? Where are they? I don't know. Joe Panora says, did you watch Terry on the Shuttlepod Show? I haven't watched Terry on the Shuttlepod Show yet, but I'm sure it's great. Scott Bartholomew says, can you imagine TNG doing a musical episode? I didn't think so. Well, you know what? Here's the funny thing. People are always throwing at me all the quote-unquote silly episodes of Star Trek. A lot of the holodeck episodes being silly. You know, but if you go back and you watch the very first holodeck episode they ever did, which was The Big Goodbye, and Picard's doing Dixon Hill, you know, Beverly dresses up as a gun mole. It shows you exactly what the holodeck should be. And at the end of that episode, when Cyrus Redblock, Lawrence Tierney, discovers that there's a new universe, like he actually becomes, like, even though he's a computer program, self-aware when he steps out into the corridor of the Enterprise out of the holodeck and he dematerializes. There's something really interesting there. The idea that these holographic life forms became self-aware of their circumstances and moved out. I mean, there's something really interesting there. And just because when Q turns everybody into Robin Hood or whatever, yeah, that's goofy the same way but the story was interesting. You know, at the end of the day, the stories aren't necessarily goofy, at least in TNG. 200 Watt Studio says, during an episode of Babylon 5, two characters, Billy Mummy and Stephen First, are talking at a bar. When cameras were about to roll, they asked J. Michael Straczynski to sit at the bar in a cameo. J. Michael Straczynski annoyingly said, no, I need to believe this world exists or I can't write it. He cared about the reality of this world. New Star Trek is the opposite. 200 Watt Studio, I couldn't agree with you more. There's no credible world building in this show at all. I don't believe any of it. I don't believe the way the Enterprise moves. Why is Ortegas given nothing to do except talking about flying the ship? She's also a great actress. Miss Navi is great. Give her a compelling story. I mean, I don't know why she's sort of sidelined. They could use her more. It's weird. Word Balloon. John Suntress, if you don't listen to the Word Balloon podcast, what's wrong with you? You should listen to it. Hi, I'm Uhura. Many of you may not know me. She's the goddamn comms officer. If there's one bridge officer every crew member would know, it's her. Bad writing. No, it's true. Because what's funny is, here's what drives me crazy about this show. If you're a science fiction writer and you know anything about world building, when you think about something, you're like, okay, if this is going on, let's presuppose that there is an infinite improbability subspace rupture or whatever. You'd sit there and go, well, wait a minute. We've already sent certain things in and music's coming back to us. We sent in the songbook. Well, why would we just want to sing? What about the messages in the songs themselves, the lyrics? Does this thing understand the lyrics? I mean, the idea of understanding what music even is, you could say that, oh, it's just the frequencies and it's still mathematics, or call it what you want. But it was kind of, I understand they needed a bullshit way to get people singing. I get that. But they never thought through what they really could do with this infinite. They just made it like, one more time, it's a universe, the whole universe is being threatened. I don't think the people that write this show have any real concept to just how fucking big the universe is. You know, they already ripped off Hitchhiker's Guide. Maybe they should read it. You know, the universe, it's big. I mean, really big. I don't think they know how big it is. And I kind of wish they did, because it would help. It would help the show if they knew just how large. I mean, they certainly don't in Discovery. But on this show, yeah, not good. 200 Watt Studio says, how do the in-story... Oh, I love this. Okay, this is a great question. How do the in-story mechanics of the Strange New Worlds musical work? Where did the music come from? How did the crew know when to dance and sync? Yeah, okay. I love that you brought this up. I didn't want to go deep into all the stuff that annoyed me about this episode. But yes, if you're singing, there's a... one of my favorite, if you want to see a great musical, you want your heart fucking broken, watch The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, another Jacques Demy movie. Like The Two Girls of Roquefort. Watch, it's an operetta in that the whole movie is sung. All the dialogue is sung. All of it. Even like someone walks into a store, hello, bonjour. I mean, and there's music, you know, na 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 na. Anyway, it's all there. But yeah, where'd this music come from? How did people know the different musical stylings? I mean, when they showed the Klingon boy band moment, when they're all like disco Klingons or whatever, you know, Earth, Wind, and Fire Klingons with auto-tune, to me, it would have been so much more interesting if the Klingons show up and they fucking blew everybody away with their song. They literally turned the Klingons into a joke. If I was telling I would tell if I was teaching a writing class, I would say, never ever diminish your adversaries by making them look stupid. You know, singing a song about their drama, we're going to kill you. I mean, the Klingons, they have a musical component to their culture. They love opera is a big deal, as we've seen. You know, I was on the set of the Deep Space Nine episode Soldiers of the Empire that LeVar Burton directed. I was on that when they were shooting the Klingon Bird of Prey, and the Klingons all sung that song. I was there when they did it. You got a little bit of a chill. And yet they could have done this really great, like I said, it could have been an MC battle at the end when each crew is making their points, and you realize we have more things that are alike than differences, or some cool shit like that. They didn't do that. But yes, 200 Watt Studio, they don't know the mechanics of any of it. And that's another thing. I didn't buy the world building. I bought it in Once More with Feeling. I bought why they were singing in that episode. 200 Watt Studio says, was there an alien Bob Fosse possessing the crew? Yeah, I mean, who choreographed all this? That's another thing. Why are we singing? I don't know. I mean, you just are, because it's a musical and we have to go with it. And they never figure that stuff out. Scott Bartholomew says, wait until Star Trek Starfleet Academy comes out, Melrose Trek. I mean, it already is Melrose Trek, but I agree with you. I think that that's exactly what it's going to be, because that's all they know how to write. I'm sure they're salivating to write that. Salivating. Scott Bartholomew says, I'm tired of Michelin-Chef Pike. Well, what's interesting is that apparently Pike's good friends, he does not maintain any sense of command decorum. Like a captain needs to have you have to follow this captain. You know, Uhura, you know, if you want to give an order to fire, go right ahead. Again, it strains credulity. I don't believe any of it. Joseph Michael says, evening, Rob. Do you have any thoughts about how the footage of the 2020 Beirut explosion is being used in the trailer for The Creator? This is an interesting question. I think this film is worth supporting, especially if it turns out to be good, but this footage ends up in the final film. Should we support it? It might seem morally dubious, but as you know, this kind of filmmaking is possibly going extinct, so I'm not sure if we as consumers can afford to be picky if we want more original content like this. What do you think? So for what Joseph is saying, there is a shot in the trailer of The Creator that shows an explosion going off. And when you compare the two shots, they actually there's all kinds of people that shot the Beirut explosion. It was a monstrous explosion. People lost their lives. It was really hardcore. And if you haven't watched, there's videos of all the different YouTube stuff, on YouTube of all the different angles that people had. It's terrifying, to be honest. And The Creator recreated those shots. There's a single shot where they basically used it. Here's why I don't have a problem with it. How many movies have shown the actual atomic bomb tests? We've seen them in countless films. Now, the difference is people didn't lose their lives. It didn't happen in a city. It didn't have a tragedy attached to it. But I see that, like, it's been put in the public domain. And maybe, by the way, maybe there's a reason why they chose, maybe they wanted to evoke what happened in Beirut, and that's why they used it. I don't think it's worth getting incensed about, because somebody took that and uploaded it to the internet, and we've all watched it a million times. That's how somebody could know that that's the explosion. If we're going to be upset about those kinds of things, I think, in a way, by using that explosion, I'd flip the script and say, is it exploitive? Yes. But it made people not forget those that lost their lives during this explosion. People are going to talk about it. No one was talking about people that might have died. People want to be outraged. And so they're going to be like, oh my God, can you believe they used that explosion? I'd say, well, you know what? The people that lost their lives in that Beirut explosion are now... I mean, it was a preventable accident, but it wasn't like it was a terrorist bombing where somebody intentionally blew people up. It was malfeasance. But in my mind, people are now talking about that incident again where it might have been lost to history. I think the fact that people are talking about it now might honor their memory. Maybe. So it's a tough one. RRTNZ says, there once was a bridge named after Chuck Norris. They had to change the name because nobody crosses Chuck Norris and lives. Cheers, mate. You and the Chuck Norris jokes. Hilarious. Joe Panora said, Terry mentioned wanting to expand Berman Trek. Well, yeah, that's what he was doing. The thing about what Terry did is that he didn't break those fourth walls. He was trying to tell a story within the universe that we recognized and understood. And characters can grow. I mean, 30 years later, they're different. You're a different person than you were. I mean, the difference between 20 and 50 is pretty extreme. So, I mean, what Terry tried to do was create a story that was set in our universe that still was credible and didn't break the fourth wall. And I think for the most part, he really succeeded, and I enjoyed it. Tach says, I'm going to make an edit of Far From Home that cuts out the very last scene with Mysterio exposing Peter's identity. I feel like it's a great epilogue to the Infinity Saga without it, because you see Tony's successors take charge and run into the future. I think it's true. I like that idea. Why not? I think that's good. Yeah. Scott Bartholomew says, I so wish there was hard sci-fi Trek with writers like Robert Bloch, Harlan Ellison, etc. So, me too. I mean, think about what they did in Discovery. What they did in Discovery was they took this is telling you everything you need to know. So, for those of you who don't know, City on the Edge of Forever, which is generally considered to be the best episode of the original series and one of the great time travel episodes ever done for TV, was written famously by Harlan Ellison, but it had to be rewritten because a lot of the elements of his script didn't really work out. And one of the things was he had an ambulatory Guardian of Forever as opposed to it being a portal that was part of a long dead civilization. Well, the writers of Discovery basically said, well, fuck that. We're going to go, because, IDW published the original script and the Tipton brothers adapted the original script for City on the Edge of Forever. We're going to go with that. I mean, and you know what that does? That puts them, they're like, you know what? It's more important than we get to do something cool than honor what came before. That honor, they totally flew in the face of that original episode. And I'm sure some self-satisfied therapied writer, probably told this therapist, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to restore Harlan Ellison's original vision because that's what I can do. And his therapist probably said, you go. So, again, the writers who are making Star Trek Strange New Worlds are more important than the show they're working on. Certainly Akiva Goldsman thinks that about himself. And it comes through in the writing. And it drives me crazy. Sean Hoover says, I thought we were going to get a Star Trek The Next Generation Darmok-like episode where the crew would have to sing to communicate with aliens. Good God, was I disappointed. Well, what you were looking for, I think, was an actual science fiction storyline, which was kind of a bummer. But I want to thank Joseph Michael for the $20 super chat about the Beirut thing. That's food for thought, but yeah, it's an interesting way to be. I think it's an interesting way to be. And Dan Candy, you made me sing, so thank you. Rob, when will you see Barbie and Oppenheimer? This weekend. I finally got tickets to go this weekend. So I'm going this weekend to see Oppenheimer in 70mm. So I am excited about that. Very much so. Very excited, as a matter of fact. So there you go. Now I have a letter. I have a letter to read. And I'm going to read that letter. Let's see. Let me get it, because I forgot to get it before I went on. And I'm going to read it. Hold on, let me get it. Why is this taking me so long? I should have prepared. Okay, here we go. This letter comes to us from Tracy and the Science Lady. Tracy, the Science Lady. So Tracy, the science lady, has been talking about there's been an ongoing debate on this channel about making love to various xenomorphs. And, of course, fuel to the fire, Secret Invasion added fuel to the fire with Nick Fury locking lips with the Skrull form of his dead ex-wife, or dead wife in Skrull form. But Science Lady wanted to run with this and perhaps do a podcast delving into this from an actual scientific standpoint. She writes, "Hey Rob, hope you're well. I watched Barbie on Sunday. It's very good. I've liked both movies. I think for Oppenheimer, one needs to watch it a few times as there's a lot to take in. I was not a huge Blur fan. I did like some music through. However, I love the Gorillaz. But their new album, Ballad for Darren, is very good. I've just ordered the CD. I still buy them. Me too. My friend watched Blur and Pulp. I'm so envious. Also, what's all this about nothing happening in the 90s? I would give you a good telling off now, Mr. Burnett, if I was in California. The 90s was my coming out era. We had Chemical Brothers, Prodigy, Britpop, Radiohead, and the greatest music in the 90s. Clubs took off, Ibiza music, dance, hip-hop, and we rediscovered the 60s. Surely you've not forgotten the era of these supermodels. And what about the movies such as Pulp Fiction and Trainspotting? London in the 90s was a cool place to be. So there. No doubt about that, but you were in London. The U.S. wasn't nearly as cool. And look, I love Trainspotting. I love that soundtrack. What can I say? I love Underworld. Born Slippy, all that stuff's great. I've just sat down from a busy few days, and I'm typing this quickly on my phone, so I'm very sorry for any typos. I thought I would let you know that things are going well with the program. It's not going to be X-rated. I'm using what I know about Earth's history, as well as geology and planetary science. Initially, I wanted to study geology and science, but I got kicked out of the course because I was the only girl in the class, and I had no choice but to study biology at the time. And that still niggles me today. I want revenge. The reason I wanted to contact you to tell you that I've written the documentary as a story or documentary, I've also researched the technology aspect. It's a podcast, so I can listen to it in the car. You can listen to it in a car, close your eyes, as well as going on your channel, because it can be streamed. I demand that I put it on my channel. I have to go. I'm doing stuff with the hope of getting the masters. I would love to work for Google or Microsoft, as they have a good program for biodiversity and climate change. Laugh out loud. If I mentioned I could be researching the latter, I would get called all sorts of things. I just laugh it off with my brother, and I end up taking the piss out of it. Anyhow, take care and have fun in the sun. Yeah, the hottest month on record, there's no climate change. It's so weird that climate change to me has become a political issue, when the idea that over the last 200 years, the industrial age we're spewing particulate matter into the atmosphere, and the Pacific gyres, there's massive amounts of plastics in the ocean that weren't there 200 years ago. Neither was the particulate matter in the atmosphere. Of course we're affecting the climate of the planet. Why wouldn't we be? And it's weird that people want to make it out as some kind of a political issue. Scott Bartholomew says, out of all the Trek series, what is your favorite episode? Oh, there's so many. There's so many Star Trek episodes that I love. But you know what? I'm going to stop. I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to answer that question because, well, I shouldn't say I'm doing my 10 and 20s, my 10 and 20s that I'm going to delve into Star Trek history. But since you asked, I can't give you a definitive answer. But, the original series, I can tell you the same things The original series episode that I really love that nobody gives the love to that I give to it is the Immunity Syndrome. I think the Immunity Syndrome is one of the great episodes of Star Trek. It never gets love, but it is a great episode. It's the second season. And you should check it out because it's really great. And it's one of those very serious, giant threats that how are we going to, along with the Doomsday Machine, which it borrows the music from, which is kind of a bummer. But it's a great episode. So you should check it out. And that, let's see. So that's the letter I was going to read. Let me see if I have any more, because I have other letters too. If you want to send me a letter, write down there. I'll read it on the show. let's see. What can I read? Oh, this is interesting. Omar94, our friend Omar94 asks, "Hi, Rob, moderators in the Post Geek Singularity. Since you've been involved in the film industry for a long time, Rob, you can probably answer this since I've always wondered. Movies don't always go to plan when making them, since we've heard plenty of stories about how certain films go over budget and over scheduling during production. However, we also hear movies getting delayed. There can be many reasons, like going over schedule, problems during production, like Tom Cruise injuring himself for Mission Impossible Fallout, or something goes on in the world like a pandemic or a writer's strike. So with that, I'm guessing delays cause heavy financial costs for studios. They do. Studios already spend a lot of money on the production and marketing of movies, so I'm guessing they also have to spend a lot more when delaying them. They do. On the other hand, there are times when movies' release dates are moved up ahead of schedule, so I'm guessing studios must also spend more money on that too, and most of the time they do. Considering that, maybe you can give us an overview of the financial costs which affect studios who must delay or sometimes bump up movies from their original release dates, since I'm pretty sure it's not like people just getting rain checks and it doesn't really cost anything. Thanks, and live long and prosper, Omar94. Well, Omar, that's actually a really good question. So I think, as I've said before on this show, one of the things people have to understand about movie making is studios do not have a vault of money that they just go down. If they're making a movie for $200 million, they go down into their money vault and pull it out. They borrow it. So when they're borrowing money to make movies, that means interest payments kick in immediately. And the longer it takes a studio to pay back those interest payments, the lot more money they have to pay. And they do have, I'm sure they have revolving credit and all that. And since movies are an ongoing concern, they don't just make movies at the box office. Money at the box office, you put them on TV, you sell them into syndication, you do all the different kinds of things. So a movie's hopefully making money for a long time. But, movies are pretty meticulously budgeted out. And if you have a movie, let's call it $200 million, which is a lot of fucking money for a movie, even though you hear about movies that cost more, $200 million is a lot of money. And that's based on a production schedule from pre-production all the way through the end of production. And if it gets, it doesn't matter if it's 1 million or 5 million or 10 or 20 million. The costs rack up. And every day there's delays. A day just doesn't cost a couple of bucks. If you miss a day of shooting, if you can't shoot with your star and you have to, you have incredible amounts of money you have to pay. That's when insurance claims come in. And it can be really, really difficult. But both if you have to push up, see if you're going to bring up, if a release date changes and bring up a movie forward, that might mean that the effects teams have to work 24/7, which means costs double or triple or sometimes quadruple. And there's a lot of money there. Then you have to get everybody who's doing the actual marketing. They have to be ramped up. So it's problematic either way. But, for the most part, the movies that I've worked on, the large-scale movies, whether it's Superman Returns or, Narnia, not so much, but X-Men. Actually, Narnia was a very, very big movie. It was a very, very expensive movie, a lot more expensive. I'm Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe I'm speaking of. But for the most part, I've watched movie productions. One of the things I love movie sets, and I love the crews that make movies because they're all really good at their jobs. They're really, really, really good at their jobs. And watching a great movie crew make their day, what I mean by make their day, they might have to shoot 4.5 pages in a day, or 5 pages, or 10 pages. 10 pages, I hope not, but I've been on sets where I had to shoot that much in a day. Femme fatales, anyone? It's great to watch people work that really know what they're doing. It really is. It's a lot of fun. Charles Davis-Aitkin sends in a $20 super chat. With Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine the best sci-fi shows? Were Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine the best sci-fi shows going head-to-head? If not, what do you think the best sci-fi shows were going head-to-head? Well, it's interesting. I always thought that Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine, even though they both took place on space stations, were pretty different shows. But I guess they probably would in terms of going head-to-head. I never thought about that. I enjoyed both shows a lot. I really like Babylon 5 and I really like Deep Space Nine for kind of different reasons. But I really did like them. I mean, Babylon 5 was much more overtly political. Not that Deep Space Nine wasn't, but I mean, Earth, we're defecting, that kind of stuff, which I really liked. And I love the Shadow War and the Psi Corps and all that. I mean, it had a lot more, it was, I think, more grounded to do with our politics, Earthbound politics, than Deep Space Nine was. Even though Deep Space Nine was full of proxy politics, it wasn't necessarily directly referring to Earth. But those are probably the best sci-fi shows going head-to-head ever, because I can't remember two similar shows that were airing kind of at the same time. That's an interesting question, but I think you're probably right about that. I can't think of two other shows, maybe superhero shows or something, but they didn't resonate as much. So that's a tough one. By the way, I want to thank you for a $20 super chat. That's very nice of you. And but it's a good question. Now I'm gonna have to go do some research. Yeah, it's good stuff. So, well, on that note, everybody, I think I'm gonna bring an end to this chat. Ultimately, to wrap this up, I didn't hate the musical episode. I thought, like so much of modern Star Trek, it could have been so much better. I really liked the cast of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, but my God, are they let down week after week after week by the writing. And, am I supposed to get excited for the non-canonical xenomorph Gorns to be evil? Am I supposed to do that? I think it's a really odd choice. Because a giant lizard monster is just evil because he's a giant lizard monster, and now we're going to make them as evil as they can by making them xenomorphs, where in the original series, again, it's such a canon violation of what the Gorn were supposed to be. And I had such affection when I was a kid for Arena, the Gorn episode. But I just can't see how the xenomorphs, as they've been portrayed, go on to become a spacefaring race. How do they grow up and have the kind of technology they have? It's so weird. Again, I think a monumental failure of imagination on the part of the writers. I wish that they would do better. But what can you do? Well, I want to thank everybody for supporting the channel via super chats and tips. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate it. Thanks for sending me letters. postgeeksingularity.com. You can send me letters, which is great. So, thank you for that. There is no member call this weekend. We're going to postpone it. Roberto's out of town, but I think I'll be doing something in place of the member call. I don't know what that is, but we won't be having a specific member call this weekend. So, anyway, I want to thank you all for being here, whether you agree with me or not. Look, I got to tell you, one of the great things about doing these shows is I love when people come at me with dissenting views. And again, being called a gate, how am I gatekeeping? You can go see whatever you want. I'm not telling you not to watch something. Everybody should love things. Look, I love things that nobody likes. So if somebody tells me that they hate something that I like, I don't care. But I understand. Everybody takes things so personally now. But I love informed debate. So if you think I'm wrong, please leave a comment. Tell me I'm wrong. Hit a like. By the way, I never say like, subscribe. Like, subscribe. That stuff's important for the channel. So if you can, like or subscribe. If you don't like something I say, please write me and take me to task. I like that. I will not bite. I love good, cogent arguments about why I'm wrong. That's how I learn. People are always saying to me, well, Rob, you follow these known fascists, racists, whites. Why do you follow those people? I'm like, I follow all kinds of people. I mean, it's so weird that I don't think that... I never thought that people I follow in a public forum would suddenly be used against me. But I like hearing from all walks of life, every shape, size, color, creed. I don't care. All I ask you to do is give me some some well-reasoned arguments. Tell me I'm a douchebag, but do it in a clever way. Do it in a way that would make your mom proud. I hate that guy. He's a douchebag. But, tell it to me with aplomb. I would love that. So tell me what... I do read the comments, and if you've got a problem or disagree with me, please say so. Hit me up on Twitter, BurnettRM, and let's talk about it. That's what this conversation's supposed to do. It's supposed to keep going forever. And on that note, everyone, I will say, remember, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. I want to thank Tom Jr. Jackson for being a great moderator. I don't know if anyone else is here moderating, but Tom Jr. Jackson is. He's ubiquitous. You know, he's everywhere. He's somebody I want in the foxhole with me at the end of the world, because I think we'd survive. And on that note, I want to say goodbye to everyone. Have a good evening.